who we are today and make this country what it is today. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Desnethé-Missinippi-Churchill River.
Madam Speaker, today I rise not only in support of my colleagues in the New Democratic Party, but also as a representative for Desnethé-Missinippi-Churchill River riding. As a Dene woman with friends and family who survived the residential school system, and as a practicing Catholic who is calling upon the leader of our church to apologize. Before beginning, I'd like to thank the survivors and families of St. Anne's residential schools for being in Ottawa today to join us on this day. Today we speak as politicians inviting the Pope to join our process of reconciliation. But no voice is more important than that of the survivors. If Canadians are to take any message away from the proceedings today, let it be the voices of the survivors who have spoken up and want the process of reconciliation to move forward in a positive way. Let it be the voices of survivors and their families that are heard loudest today. Thank you for being here. Merci Cho. As I'm sure the members of this House are aware, His Holiness Pope Francis has decided that he could not personally apologize for the systemic racism experienced by survivors and victims of residential schools. The decision by Pope Francis is incredibly disheartening to me. The people in my riding, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and Catholics, and people from all across Canada, the pain that is carried by the survivors today is real. And it's in the spirit of moving forward, of relieving that suffering and building a relationship based on love and understanding that we invite the Pope to join us and to reconsider. As I said, I'm a practicing Catholic woman. I have very fond memories of growing up in the church and practicing and participating in the church-led community programs. The church is incredibly important to folks in Desnethé-Missinippi-Churchill River. Not only does it provide a sense of unity among our small communities, but the space the church creates gives us a gathering place to join together and help our communities. The Catholic Church back home gives spaces for families to celebrate, mourn, rejoice, and forgive. It runs summer camps, community drives, food banks, and hosts garage sales. All of this is in addition to the regular Sunday Mass and daily church services. Furthermore, because our communities are so isolated from the rest of Canada, we can find some common ground with folks in the big cities through the practice of our faith. At the end of the day, we all belong to the same Catholic family. That's why when in 1987, the people of Fort Simpson in the Northwest Territories were ecstatic for the visit from Pope John Paul II. The Pope's visit to the Catholic Dene community was thrilling and showed that we were members of the same community. Whether you walk the halls of the Vatican adorned by artistic masterpieces, or you look at the drawings your children made on the refrigerator, our shared belief humbles us and returns us to our sense of belonging in God's love. Even though Catholic Canadians live far apart and our communities are quite different, we're all united through our shared faith. And while I wasn't there that day in Fort Simpson, I did have the privilege to see the Pope in 1993 in Denver, Colorado. For several days that summer, I led a group of youth from northern Saskatchewan communities to World Youth Day, and we met young Catholics from across the globe. We shared stories, shared pieces of our homes, and prayed together. It was a moving experience, and I think back to those days and remember how the experience changed my life. So, for that reason, Madam Speaker, I hope that Pope Francis accepts the invitation to come and visit Canadians. I know how life-changing seeing your spiritual leader can be, and in his visit here, I hope that the Pope will acknowledge the influence of Catholic spirituality on the lives of survivors, and that he'll apologize on behalf of the Catholic Church to the families and survivors of those who experienced the tragedy that was the Indian residential school program. Madam Speaker, I'd like to emphasize my appreciation for the Pope and Catholic bishops of Canada in considering the invitation from the Prime Minister. Back in my riding, we have a very strong relationship with the Archbishop, and I hope they view the motion today as a meaningful and earnest request to include the Pope in our process of reconciliation. I understand the position that the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops has communicated through their message to us from a few weeks ago, but I hope they'll take the time to reconsider and support us in listening to the stories that we've heard today. Madam Speaker, I've heard from many of the families and survivors of residential day schools and boarding schools in Desnethé-Missinippi-Churchill River. Their message is clear. If we as a faith-based community want to move forward in reconciliation, then we must continue to ask for an apology and have the documents we need in order for the truth to come out. Mr. Speaker, it's not easy to move on from the statement put out by the Catholic bishops. I was frustrated and disappointed, like many friends and family back home, that the Pope decided he couldn't personally apologize. I hope that the bishops and the Pope understand our persistence. For the Indigenous families and survivors in my riding, many of whom are practicing Catholics, we turn to our spiritual leader for guidance and for advice. But without an apology, without hearing the words come from the Pope himself, we feel no sense of closure. So that's why we ask directly now, will the Pope respond to call to action 58 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and issue a formal papal apology for the role of the Canadian Catholic Church in the establishment, operations, and the abuses of the residential schools? Now that the truths and stories of the residential school program are public knowledge, meaning that Canadian society at large knows at least something about residential schools, we all have an obligation in some way to acknowledge the role that the institutions and social systems that we are a part of were complicit in allowing the abuses and elimination of culture to happen. I call upon the Pope to acknowledge his position as an historical figure and apologize on behalf of those who came before him. I invite the Pope in his capacity as leader of the present-day Church to apologize. I call upon the Pope to understand that as a spiritual leader for young Catholics in residential schools, that it was to our God that students appeal for salvation, hope, and hope, only for salvation and hope to be forgotten. I know that the Catholics in Saskatchewan would appreciate an apology from the leader of the Church. An apology at this level is not unprecedented, so our request is not unreasonable. Previous popes have apologized for Catholic abuse in Ireland in 2010, to the Indigenous peoples of the Americas for colonization in 2015, and to the victims of abuse in Chile just this past year. An apology now would be no different and provide the same reassurance and respect owed to the victims and survivors in Canada. We're all on this road to reconciliation together, but in order to move forward down this road, we need to know the pathways from which we came. Survivors of residential schools need cooperation from the Church and its entities to see their own documents. Scholars should have access to historical documents where appropriate. Everyone in this country, both our current and future generations, should have access to the full record of what happened in the residential school system. I invite the Pope to share the documents that the Church has with regards to residential schools, and I invite all people in Canada to read and understand the knowledge that has been gathered already and stay aware of what that information which has yet to be shared. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to reiterate that our request is done so out of the deepest respect and reverence for the members of the Church, for the bishops, and to the Pope. At this point in the reconciliation process, we know that finger-pointing and laying blame only breeds hostility and further divides those on all sides of reconciliation. Instead, we invite the Pope and all Catholics in the spirit of moving forward to join us in reconciling the past, sharing our knowledge, experiencing remorse, participating in dialogues, and listening to survivors are meaningful ways to move forward together as a society and as a community united by our faith. Thank you.
Question, commentaire. The honourable member for Scarborough-Gilwood.
I want to thank the honourable member for her speech. I think made ever more eloquent by the fact that she is a practicing Catholic, and may I even say a disappointed Catholic. I'm not a Catholic. In fact, my ancestors were so upset with the Catholic Church, they all became Protestants, which means Protestants. So I wanted to talk about, the day after this motion passes. And it's pretty obvious that there's a kind of almost a unanimity in this chamber. And the key issue is the request for an apology, a papal apology. It's pretty clear that at this point the papal apology is not going to be forthcoming. And so the question becomes, and she used the word finger pointing, and I think there is some element of that in our conversation today. The question becomes, does this conversation, which I think it's an important conversation, move us further along the path of reconciliation, or does it, in effect, freeze us in place or move us back from reconciliation?
The honourable member for Desnethé-Missinippi-Churchill River.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. Thank you very much. The process of reconciliation to occur for all survivors, families and friends, communities, Canadians, and everyone in Canada and around the world. The churches, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, United Church, the list goes on. It is very, very significant in the process of reconciliation that we continue to talk. But beyond talking, we need action. That's why we have the debate today. We are asking, I'm asking, as an Indigenous woman from Northern Saskatchewan, on behalf of my constituents, asking the Pope for him to come to Canada. I'm also asking, as an MP for Desnethé-Missinippi-Churchill River riding, for the Pope to come to Canada, like Pope John Paul II did, to come and visit us and issue an apology. I think reconciliation, every Canadian, everyone in Canada, all the churches, all the survivors have a role to play in reconciliation.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would also like to congratulate my colleague on her very thoughtful comments today. The NDP have chosen, I think, to focus in on one area or one call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and obviously in response to some disappointing news a few weeks ago. But I wonder if she could sort of comment in terms of there is a sort of a tracker in terms of the progress that's being made on all 94 calls to action, and if she could maybe speak briefly to her sense of the movement on those other areas that have, again, out of the 94 that the federal government is directly responsible for.
The honourable member for Desnethé-Missinippi-Churchill River.
The question, I will answer it in different areas. As an Indigenous woman from Northern Saskatchewan, when I look at Canada as a Dene woman, and when I speak my language, Dene-Sumkline, in my communities, Canada has made very little progress when it comes to reconciliation. And we see that the evidences within the justice system, families continue to get hurt, funding that gets cut to even to First Nations, the 2% cap that the Prime Minister promised to cut and is still in place. Snow reserves across Canada, the drinking water, the infrastructure around that is still an issue. Poor housing for First Nations, employment, youth opportunities, and the list go on. Canada has so much work to do in apologizing, in working with First Nations, Métis, Inuit families across Canada. So that's where I will leave it.
Reprise du débat, resuming